Darnell James adjusted his tie in the mirror, his reflection staring back at him with the same familiar intensity. He was 30 now, an associate at Fitzgerald and McLean, one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in the city. He was on the verge of something monumental. He could feel it. This was it. Today's meeting, this case, was going to be the breakthrough he needed. Darnell had worked too damn hard, sacrificed too much, for anything less than success. He had made it to this point not through connections or favors, but through sheer, relentless determination. But as his eyes scanned the dark brown eyes staring back at him, a knot tightened in his stomach. Was it enough? He tugged at the collar of his crisp white shirt, the fabric feeling stiffer than usual. A slight quiver of doubt. He wiped his hands on his pants, reminding himself that confidence was the only thing that could carry him through. The firm had always talked about valuing diversity, about being proud of the way they embraced change. But Darnell knew the truth. He'd always known it. No one ever said it aloud, but in a place like this, the old boys' club was real. Darnell had worked for years to push past that invisible wall. He wasn't just a good lawyer, he was a damn good one. And today, the partnership meeting was going to prove it. He picked up his briefcase, checked that his notes were neatly stacked inside, and stepped out of his apartment. The city was waking up around him, cars honking, people hustling along the sidewalks, the smell of coffee wafting from the corner cafe. But Darnell was used to it. He had walked this path 1,000 times, his boots hitting the pavement with rhythmic precision. He was moving, always moving. The world didn't stop, and neither could he. Fitzgerald and McLean was housed in a skyscraper that scraped the sky, its glass windows reflecting the city's businesslike, cold exterior. The lobby was sleek, polished marble floors glinting in the light. Darnell walked past the front desk without a second glance. "Good morning, Mr. James," a receptionist called, but he was already on his way toward the elevator. He gave her a brief nod, acknowledging the pleasantries as he pressed the button to the 32nd floor. The elevator ride was quiet. Just the faint hum of machinery and the soft chime of the ascending floors. Darnell checked his phone again, making sure all the details were fresh in his mind. This case was huge. Carter Industries, a multi-billion-dollar client. If he could close this one, the partnership would be his for the taking. He stepped out onto the floor and immediately felt the shift in energy. Fitzgerald and McLean had that effect on you, like you were part of something bigger, something that ran deeper than just law. It was about power, about influence, and most of all, about who you knew. The people who'd come before him, the ones who'd shaped this place, none of them looked like him. He passed several colleagues who waved, a few offering polite smiles, but Darnell's mind was focused on the task ahead. He walked into his office and placed his briefcase on the desk. The windows overlooked the city, a view that still amazed him every day. He dreamed of this office for so long, but it didn't feel like his. Not yet. It was 8:55 a.m. when Evan Fitzgerald walked into his office, the sharp click of his shoes on the polished floor breaking Darnell's concentration. Darnell hadn't been looking forward to working with Evan, but he hadn't expected the younger man to show up so early either. Evan, short, stocky, with a jawline that could cut glass, had the air of someone who knew exactly what he was worth. He looked at Darnell, giving him one of those lazy, condescending smiles that was always just a little too smug. "Morning, Darnell," Evan said, pulling out a chair with a loud scrape. "Excited for today? This one's big." Darnell forced a smile and nodded. "Always." Evan sat down, casually flipping through a set of papers. "I was talking to a few of the partners last night," he began, looking up at Darnell over the top of his glasses. "They're really excited about this case. They want us to really bring the heat. You know, put on a show. After all, Carter's a top client. We can't afford to look sloppy." Darnell's jaw tightened. He knew what Evan was doing, subtle, underhanded. He wasn't just giving advice, he was trying to take credit for the case before it even started, trying to establish himself as the leader in this partnership. Evan had a way of getting under your skin like that, all smooth talk and hidden barbs, but Darnell wasn't going to let him get to him. He'd had enough of Evan's passive-aggressive tactics. This wasn't the first time Evan had tried to play games. Darnell had learned over the years to pick his battles. "Of course," Darnell said, his voice steady. "I'll make sure the strategy's clear when we present it. We'll hit them with everything we've got." Evan leaned back in his chair, nodding. "Good. You know, I've been working with Carter for years, so I've got a few ideas on how we can approach them. I'll send you the notes later." Darnell felt the pit in his stomach tighten, but he didn't let it show. Evan's ideas were often little more than recycled, half-baked notions that looked good on paper but lacked substance. Yet every time Evan spoke, it was as though his opinion was gospel. And it wasn't just this case. Darnell had seen it before. Evan always had to have the last word, always had to be the one in control, even when it meant undermining others to get there. "I'll wait for your notes," Darnell said. "I'm sure they'll be helpful." The words came out polite, calm, but they hung in the air like a challenge. Evan just smiled again, that smug little grin that Darnell could never quite shake. "Good. Well, I'll see you in the meeting then. Let's knock this out of the park." The clock ticked steadily toward 9:30 a.m., and Darnell felt the weight of the meeting ahead settle on his shoulders. The partners would be watching. They always were. This case was his shot. No matter what Evan thought, Darnell knew his plan. His strategy was solid. It had to be. But as the elevator doors opened and the partners filed in, Ms. Thompson, Mr. Alvarez, Mr. Fitzgerald, and the rest, Darnell couldn't help but wonder if this was it. If just this once he could break through. If this time the walls wouldn't close in on him. And as the partners took their seats, Evan flashed him one last look. Brief, but loaded. It wasn't just the case at stake today. It was everything. Darnell sat at his desk, staring at the screen, but his mind wasn't on the case. He had just returned from the first round of meetings with the partners and was trying to catch his breath. The words of Miss Thompson, the managing partner, echoed in his ears. "This is a big one, Darnell. You've got this." But the more he thought about it, the more his stomach churned. She'd said it like it was simple, like the next step was already laid out before him. But it wasn't simple. It never was. Darnell had spent the last week immersing himself in the Carter Industries case, combing through documents, reviewing past contracts, and strategizing every angle. Everything was going according to plan, until Evan Fitzgerald walked in and made everything complicated. It had started with the phone call on Tuesday. Evan's voice was smooth, his tone the kind that made Darnell's skin crawl. "Hey, Darnell," Evan had said almost too casually. "I was thinking about the Carter case and I've got a few ideas we should try out. Nothing major, just some tweaks to what you're already doing. Just trust me on this one." "Sure," Darnell replied, not wanting to rock the boat. But the words left him uneasy. Evan's tweaks had a way of turning into his ideas, his contributions. Darnell had seen it happen before with other colleagues, and it always made him wonder why he was being so polite, letting someone who had no real stake in the case steer the ship. Still, he pushed the thought to the back of his mind. This was important, too important to let something so petty get in the way. The next morning, when Darnell showed up early to finalize the proposal for the partners, Evan was already in his office. There was a pile of papers on the desk, all marked up in red ink. Darnell's heart sank when he saw it. "Morning," Evan said, leaning back in his chair, completely at ease. "I took the liberty of making some changes. I think this will sell the client more effectively. We can't afford to look weak, right?" Darnell studied the papers. Evan had crossed out large sections of the document and inserted his own suggestions. They weren't bad per se, but they weren't the approach he had planned. More than that, the changes looked like they'd been designed to downplay Darnell's role in the case altogether. "Evan," Darnell said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I don't know about these changes. I've already discussed these points with Carter's team. They're expecting our strategy to be more aggressive, not watered down." Evan waved a dismissive hand. "Don't worry about it. I've got a better sense of how they think. Trust me, this is what they want." Darnell forced a smile, but inside, he felt the walls closing in. The subtle undermining was one thing, but now it felt like Evan was playing with fire. This was his case, his responsibility. Evan was nothing more than a thorn in his side, trying to take credit for everything Darnell had worked for. The worst part? Darnell wasn't sure how to fight it. He had seen the power dynamics at play, how Evan's family had been part of the firm for generations, how they had influence in ways Darnell could only dream of. Evan had the ear of the partners. He could sway their opinions with the flick of a wrist. If Darnell pushed back too hard, it could backfire. But if he didn't push back at all, it would be another case of someone else stealing his thunder. The next few days passed in a haze of conference calls, strategy meetings, and late-night work. The closer they got to the final pitch to Carter Industries, the more Darnell began to see just how far Evan was willing to go to get the spotlight. Every email he received from Evan seemed to come with subtle corrections or alterations to Darnell's work. Every idea he shared seemed to be enhanced by Evan, who was quick to take credit in meetings with the partners. By Thursday afternoon, Darnell couldn't take it anymore. The little things were starting to add up. Evan rewording his arguments, Evan jumping into meetings without invitation, Evan recommending changes to documents that Darnell had already finalized. The final straw came during a lunch meeting with Carter's VP of Legal Affairs, Susan Hayes. Darnell had prepped for this meeting for weeks. He'd tailored the proposal to meet Carter's long-term goals. It was a big moment, a chance to prove that his vision was not only sharp, but aligned with the client's best interests. But when the meeting began, Evan took over. He started discussing different angles of the proposal, offering suggestions that Darnell had never even mentioned. The client looked at Evan, nodding in agreement. It was subtle, but the message was clear. Susan was buying what Evan was selling, not Darnell. Darnell's pulse quickened. He could feel the sweat gathering at the back of his neck as Evan spoke with increasing confidence. Darnell had never felt so small in his own element. His mind raced. Was this happening? Was he really being shut out of his own case? Evan didn't even look at him for support or input. Darnell cleared his throat. Susan, with all due respect, the proposal we've drafted isn't just about short-term gains. It's about sustainability for Carter Industries. We're not just trying to win this contract. We're aiming to build a long-term relationship, and that requires a different approach. Evan glanced at him, an almost imperceptible smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Sure, but let's keep it real, Evan interrupted. Clients love a good quick fix. We should give them what they want up front, then focus on the long term once we have them in the door. Darnell's chest tightened. The disrespect, the subtle manipulation, it was all laid bare in that one moment. Susan raised an eyebrow, looking from Darnell to Evan. I see. Well, I think we'll need to review both options thoroughly. The meeting ended in a tense silence, the weight of unsaid words pressing down on Darnell's shoulders. As they walked back to the elevator, he finally turned to Evan, his voice low but firm. You can't keep doing this, Evan. I'm in charge of this case. Evan stopped, his face unreadable. You may be in charge, Darnell, he said softly, but I'm the one who gets results. You might want to remember that before this whole thing blows up in your face. Darnell's hands balled into fists, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. As the elevator doors closed, Darnell stared at his reflection in the glass. He didn't recognize the man in front of him. Not yet. But it was clear. If he wanted to keep his career intact, he was going to have to change the way he played this game. And fast. Darnell could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him like a 100-pound rock. Carter Industries was counting on him. The firm was watching him. He'd spent months perfecting the strategy for this case, and now Evan had completely hijacked it, turning it into something else entirely. The partners would meet tomorrow, and he would either walk into that room with the partnership offer in hand, or he would be sent back to the drawing board, undermined, discredited, a footnote in the firm's history. The final round of meetings with Carter Industries was scheduled for the next day, and everything was on the line. Darnell had spent the last few hours in his office, poring over the materials one last time, trying to put together a strategy that would satisfy both the client and his firm. The pieces weren't fitting together. He stood up from his desk, pacing back and forth. Evan's words, his snide remarks, the underhanded tactics, echoed in his mind like a constant hum. He tried to shake them off, but the frustration was unbearable. It was hard to concentrate with the knowledge that the man who had been undermining him for weeks was about to show up, take over yet another critical moment, and leave him with nothing but a bruised reputation. This couldn't go on. At 7:30 a.m., Darnell arrived at the office early, hoping to get a jump on the day. The floor was quiet, save for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the clacking of keyboard keys in the distance. He was ready to hit the ground running, except he wasn't sure which ground he was even standing on anymore. His thoughts kept circling back to the one question that had consumed him for the past few days. How much longer could he take this? A knock at his door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Darnell didn't even look up as the door opened. "Come in," he said, his voice tired. It was Evan. He stepped into the office, looking every bit the picture of smug self-assurance. Darnell could smell the faint trace of his cologne, a brand that cost more than his entire wardrobe. "Big day ahead," Evan said, smiling as he casually dropped a stack of papers on Darnell's desk. "I've gone through the latest drafts. We're almost there. Just need to fine-tune a couple of things before the meeting with Carter." Darnell closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He knew what was coming. He had to do this now, before it was too late. "No," Darnell said firmly, his voice steady despite the fire burning in his chest. "No more changes, Evan. I've worked too hard on this to let you swoop in and take credit for my work again." Evan blinked, then chuckled, a smug little laugh that grated on Darnell's nerves. "You've worked hard, sure. But the thing is, Darnell, the partners want results. And I've been giving them results. You've been fine, but we both know you don't have the experience I do when it comes to handling clients like Carter. So you should trust me on this one." Darnell stood up, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. His mind raced, his pulse quickening. This was it. The moment he had been dreading. The moment he had to confront Evan directly, face to face. No more hiding behind professionalism. The gloves were off. "No, Evan," Darnell said, the words coming out sharp, like they had been building inside him for too long. "You've been undermining me, undermining this whole case, and I'm done letting you control it. I'm the one who put in the work. I'm the one who built the strategy. I'm the one who earned this." Evan's smirk faltered for just a second, but then he shrugged it off, leaning against the doorframe with his usual casual ease. "You're making a scene, Darnell. This isn't a place for tantrums." "Then maybe I've been too polite," Darnell shot back. "I've been waiting for the right moment to call you out, but you keep pushing me. Do you really think you can play this game and not get caught? You've been taking credit for my ideas, my work, and I'm done with it." For a moment, there was a tense silence. Darnell could feel his heart pounding, the adrenaline surging through his veins. Evan looked at him, a brief flash of something unrecognizable crossing his face before he masked it with his usual cool demeanor. "Fine," Evan said, his voice still dripping with condescension. "If you want to go down in flames, be my guest. But don't come crying to me when this blows up in your face." Darnell didn't flinch. He didn't have time to waste. "I'm done playing your game, Evan. I'll present the case my way. I'll do it without you. Let's see how far you get then." Evan paused. For the first time, there was no smug grin on his face, no arrogance, just a brief, flickering doubt. Then, in a movement so quick it almost caught Darnell off guard, Evan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't know what you're up against, Darnell," Evan warned, his tone colder now. "This isn't just about the case anymore. You're playing with fire, and you'll get burned." "I'm already burned," Darnell snapped, "but at least I'm standing on my own 2 feet. With that, Evan turned and walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Darnell stood there, staring at the door, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling with each breath. His body felt like it had been through a battle, but somehow he had won this round. By the time the meeting with Carter Industries arrived, Darnell felt a mix of nerves and determination. He had prepared everything, his strategy, his pitch, his arguments. He knew that Evan wouldn't be backing him up, but it didn't matter anymore. This was his moment. This was his fight. As he walked into the sleek conference room, the partners and the Carter executives were already seated, waiting for him. Darnell took a deep breath and stepped to the front of the room, his mind clear, his resolve solidifying with each step. The moment he began speaking, the room grew still. Darnell felt the power of his words as they poured out with confidence. His strategy was bold but calculated, a direct reflection of his understanding of Carter Industries' needs. He spoke with clarity, unwavering in his delivery. For once, there was no fear, no hesitation. Darnell wasn't just presenting a case, he was presenting himself. This was his fight, and he was going to win it. As he wrapped up his presentation, he looked around the room. Miss Thompson's eyes were focused, nodding slightly. Mr. Alvarez, who had always been skeptical of his approach, was quiet, considering every word. And then there was Evan, sitting at the back of the room, arms crossed, watching as Darnell delivered the final blow. The silence stretched for a few moments before Miss Thompson spoke. "Thank you, Darnell. This is exactly the kind of leadership we need. The partners and I will discuss this further, but we're impressed." Darnell held his breath. Finally, the words came. "Congratulations, Darnell," Miss Thompson said, her voice firm. "The partnership is yours." Darnell sat in his office, staring at the partnership offer in front of him. The gold-embossed letters of Fitzgerald and McLean on the top of the letterhead almost seemed to mock him. His fingers hovered over the paper, the weight of what it represented heavy in the air. It wasn't just a career milestone, it was the culmination of everything he'd fought for. But as he looked at the document, something gnawed at him, a restlessness he couldn't shake. It had been 2 weeks since the meeting with Carter Industries, 2 weeks since Miss Thompson had handed him the partnership with a smile, her words almost ringing in his ears. "You earned this, Darnell. This firm needs you." And yet, the excitement he thought he'd feel was missing. The victory, while satisfying, didn't taste as sweet as he had imagined. It was complicated. The firm had congratulated him. They had been polite in their acknowledgement, but it wasn't the same as true acceptance. There was a shift in the air when he walked through the halls now. Whispers, glances, the occasional forced smile. It was like he had become a curiosity, not a colleague. They had given him the partnership, but they hadn't fully embraced him into the fold. And in a place like Fitzgerald and McLean, that mattered. As Darnell prepared to sign the letter, a knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced up to see Miss Thompson standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable but steady. "Got a minute?" she asked, stepping inside without waiting for his reply. "Of course," Darnell said, setting the pen down. He straightened, preparing himself for whatever was coming next. He had come to respect Miss Thompson over the years, not just for her leadership, but for the way she navigated the firm's complicated power structure. Her backing meant something. She had been the one to call him into her office, to validate his worth when no one else would. She took a seat across from him, her eyes scanning the room briefly before meeting his gaze. "Congratulations, Darnell. You've earned this," she said, her voice as calm and direct as ever. "Thanks," Darnell replied, his tone guarded. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he could feel something was off. "However," Miss Thompson continued, her voice softening just slightly, "I know that you've felt the weight of this place. I know you've felt it in the halls, in the meetings, and, most importantly, in the way people look at you. It's not easy, I know." Darnell's heart skipped. He hadn't expected her to speak so plainly, to acknowledge the silent battle he had fought every day, just to prove that he belonged. "I appreciate you acknowledging that," Darnell said slowly. "But I've made my peace with it. This isn't about fitting in anymore. It's about what I can do now that I'm here, what I can change." Miss Thompson nodded, her expression serious but understanding. "I've seen that fire in you, Darnell. I wouldn't have offered you this partnership if I didn't believe in your potential. But let me be clear. This firm needs people like you, people who are willing to challenge the system, even from the inside. You have the power to change things, to make this firm better, to make it more inclusive." Darnell leaned back in his chair, absorbing her words. He could feel his pulse quicken. Change the system? The challenge of that hung in the air like an unspoken promise. He had thought that getting the partnership would be the end of the road, the victory. But Miss Thompson was right. It was only the beginning. The real work was just starting. But did he have it in him? Could he change the culture that had been in place for decades? Could he confront the racism, the subtle favoritism, and the blind loyalty to tradition that had defined this place for so long? Or was this just the start of a different, more insidious battle? Before Darnell could answer his own questions, Miss Thompson stood, her gaze never leaving his. "I'll let you think about it," she said, almost as if she'd read his mind. "But don't wait too long. You've earned this position, and now it's time to use it." With that, she walked out, leaving Darnell alone with his thoughts. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a moment, the world outside his office seemed distant, silent. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and congratulatory handshakes. People who had barely acknowledged him before now treated him with a certain deference. Some were genuinely happy for him. Others, it seemed, were just playing the game, trying to stay in his good graces. Darnell had seen it all before, smiling faces hiding their true feelings. But something had changed in him. As he sat in the conference room during a critical meeting, something clicked. He had the power now. He could be more than just a figurehead. He could bring others up with him. There were so many talented people at the firm who were ignored, passed over. He could help them too. Maybe he couldn't change everything overnight, but he could start. It was in the small moments, the subtle shifts, that real change began to happen. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. That evening, as Darnell walked out of the office, the city skyline gleaming in the distance, he paused at the edge of the sidewalk, his hand brushing the smooth stone of the building's exterior. The world hadn't just handed him this victory. He had taken it. And with that, a quiet resolve settled in his chest. He was no longer just surviving this world. He was going to change it.